Hello and welcome to this session, which I think it goes without saying, and I think the panel members will agree with me, is a terribly important session for so many reasons. One reason being is that it really matters. What happens on this issue really does affect people's lives. Now, it is called Labour and Human Rights. Can we afford them in the global financial crisis? Just to emphasise that. And I have a terrifically well-informed panel to talk about that, but just if I may digress before I introduce them, I want to tell you a story. Now, in another life, I worked for Senator John Button. God bless him. He's now departed, but he was a wonderful man and he taught me many, many things. But when he was vitally concerned in Australia with the way globalisation would work and the way it would affect people's lives, and he used to tell a little story, which I think is pertinent to this discussion today, and I hope you'll agree with me. And it starts something like this. There's a couple of guys and they're out in the wilderness and they are hiking. And they discover very rapidly that they are being chased by a nasty pack of bears that want to eat them. And they are running and the bears are chasing them and the bears are getting much closer. And they're running harder and the bears are still getting closer. When suddenly one of the blokes stops, sits down on a rock, pulls out his backpack and gets out a pair of running shoes, very flash running shoes. And the bloke next to me says, "What on earth are you doing?" And he said, "I'm getting out these shoes so I can run faster." And the bloke said, "But the bears are still going to catch us." And he says, "No, no, no, no. I'm going to run faster than you. They're going to catch you." Now, sometimes when he would tell this joke, people would come up and say, "Minister, what was the brand of the shoe?" They had missed the point. The point of this is relativity. And relativity in a globalised world, I think everyone will agree, is everything. And the reality is with the global financial crisis, which from here on in we may call the slathering bear, coming after us all, it will not escape employers and employees that labour is a very big input cost in many industries. And it's very easy to see the possibility of lowering your labour costs as a way of having a better set of running shoes and getting away from the bear. And the question is, how do we balance that out? Now, with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panel today. Professor Margaret Levy is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she took up her chair at the US Studies Centre in Sydney earlier this year. Her home base is the University of Washington in Seattle, and she has many, many qualifications. But for our purposes, she is an expert in international studies, and she specifically is very interested in the issue of human rights and labour rights in the global marketplace. Andrew Hewitt is the Executive Director of Oxfam Australia. His organisation is vitally concerned with raising living standards in developing countries and all countries across the globe. And of course, he would know, as you would know, that getting work is a very important part of raising those standards. Jay Radisich is the CEO of the Council of Small Business of Australia. More than anyone on this panel, I think I could say that she gets a very close look, a grassroots look at the impact of the global financial crisis on small business, which employs so many Australians and can so rapidly be affected by things that happen both here and overseas. And Tony Maher is the General President of the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, and with a very special interest in the mining and energy sector, which has been much talked about, much debated, and where there are often furious labour debates. So I welcome them all here today, and I want to ask, first up, a very quick question, if you would answer fairly in rapid-fire fashion, if you like. Can we afford to maintain labour and human rights with the bear of the global financial crisis coming down on us? Perhaps first of all, Andrew, you.
Well, we can't not afford. In fact, if anything, as a result of the global financial crisis, we've got an even greater need to pay attention to human rights and to labour rights. For people in developing countries, the global financial crisis is a triple whammy. It's on top of the food increases in food prices and the increasingly evident impacts of climate change. And now's the time to be paying more attention to human rights, more attention to labour rights, not less attention.
Professor Margaret Levy, what do you say?
I couldn't agree more. We absolutely have to pay attention to labour rights and human rights. And there is a question of relativity and there is a question of competitiveness in the world. And I do think that the only way that many developing countries have a chance of competing is if they actually do improve their labour rights and create a set of workers who can produce a decent product, create a reliable labour force, and do it at a wage at which they can exist.
Tony Marr?
Oh, look, it's essential for the economy, whether you're talking about the developing world or the developed world. One of the contributors to the global financial crisis, in my view, was the inequality in the US economy. I mean, the absence of labour rights and effective collective bargaining laws meant that the wealth generated over the previous 3 decades didn't filter through to the working poor. And that was a big factor in the credit crunch. Unsustainable asset levels and debt levels, and that was exacerbated greatly by the lack of diffusion of that wealth.
Jay Radisich, from a small business point of view, what do you say to that?
I say absolutely. I know perhaps some people in the audience might have been expecting me to say something else, but it does start at the definition of human rights, and for me that's the articles outlined in the UDHR. So I think they are absolutely fundamental to all of us, whether we run businesses or we work in them. But as our fellow panellists have, well, my fellow panellists have mentioned, you need people to run the economy. People are society, so absolutely human rights are fundamental, but it's about how we define them and, importantly, how we apply them.
Okay, so let me start now on the broader issues and looking at how the global financial crisis is impacting. When you look around the businesses in Australia, how much pressure are they under, and how tempting is it to think, look, if I could only get those labour costs a little cheaper, this would be better for me?
Depends on the nature of the employer, depends on the nature of the business.
Well, who's really under pressure?
Yeah, most small businesses are under pressure. We actually had the National Small Business Summit in Melbourne yesterday. I just flew in this morning, and one of the presentations yesterday afternoon was from Dun & Bradstreet, who do a lot of credit reporting. And they indicated that there's an absolutely massive spike in companies defaulting on their payments. Terms are extending out from 30 to 60 days in the last, say, year and a half, out to 75 days and beyond. So there's massive cash flow problems for many businesses. They're holding a lot less stock as a way to keep costs down. But the smart small business people, and this was a sentiment that came through really strongly in our conference yesterday, doesn't look to cutting their labour costs or the total quantum of labour that they have in the business. It's only, I would put to you, it's only it is a last resort for the most responsible small business owners. Okay, so tell me this. At this point, what is the feedback you're getting about, say, paid maternity leave? Universal paid maternity leave as proposed by the government? Yes. It's great. Yes. So it's no imposition? Women are always going to have babies. People are always going to employ women. Well, some of you. This whole PML thing, I think, has been blown out of proportion. Yeah. I mean, if the government had proposed a model whereby individual companies would have had to carry the burden of those costs, we would be having a completely different argument. But they've proposed universal access, paid parental leave, in fact. I think it's not PML, it's paid PPL. Everybody benefits equally, life goes on. We're finally getting up to standard with some of the more progressive European countries. I don't know what the big deal is. Okay, fair enough. Well, Tony Marr, can I bring you into the discussion at this point? Where are you seeing the hotspots in Australia, continue to talk about for the time being, in terms of the desire perhaps to cut some corners to lower those labour costs? Has there been that pressure here, do you think?
Yeah, there has, and as you would expect, it varies between industry sectors. In mining, there's actually been a fairly cooperative approach between capital and labour about burden sharing, reducing hours and changing rosters. We just had a mine in Queensland take a month's leave, the whole workforce, by agreement. They have the capacity to do that because they're treading water to the next boom. Because in resources, with the competitive advantages we've got, it's only a matter of time. It's tougher in manufacturing, where there's been, for some decades, a long-term drift to low-wage countries. So when they have labour cost challenges, it's a sharper discussion and with more drastic consequences. And there is some of that. That said, I think it's important that the discussion that we're debating is about labour rights, not so much labour standards. But in Australia at the moment, yes, labour standards are being debated, but fortunately we're relatively better off than many other countries.
Well, I was going to say, with new legislation coming in, there is some sense in which the rights of workers have actually been enhanced in the last 6 to 9 months. Is that a fair comment?
Oh yes, from the 1st of July we'll have some bargaining rights that were absent for some time under the previous government. We'll have good faith bargaining provisions, which I understand exist in China but don't exist presently in Australia. So we are going forward.
All right. Professor Margaret Levy, could you perhaps reflect on what you've seen since you've been in Australia in terms of the way these issues have been dealt with in the face of the global financial crisis? Do you have an observation
In
on that?
Australia?
Yeah.
Well, better than in the U.S. I agree with my union brother, Tony, here on that. I really do want to turn it a little to the U.S. and to other parts of the world, if that's okay, because that's much closer to what I can address. And I think that there are 2 ways to think about this from the perspective of someone in the U.S. One is the rights of workers in the U.S., which have been terrifically eroded over the last more than 30 years. It's a very segmented labor force, and we're seeing it happening with the automobile crisis. Part of the reason that there's an automobile crisis is that, and only part of the reason, is that Toyota, Honda, other corporations have put themselves in the United States and are producing a much better product car, I agree, but also at a lower cost because they've placed themselves in the South and in other parts of the country where there are no labor rights. So they're not playing on a competitive labor field. They haven't, as we say, taken wages out of the competition. Then you think about trade with the rest of the world, and we come into a whole nother set of problems. And whether or not consumers are going to be willing to pay a price that ensures labor rights in the rest of the world and with our trading partners, and whether the brands, the shoes that your senator began to wear, the Nikes or the Adidas or whatever, whether those brands will actually continue to live up to the kinds of labor codes that they've begun to impose on themselves, continue to pay for the corporate social responsibility people that they've put on staff in order to monitor these chains.
Tell us about that. What is your observation about what is happening? Because I think when I talked to you sort of in a pre-interview, you said, look, we have made some strides in making companies like Nike have a social responsibility. Is it possible that that gets turned back now in the light of this?
Well, I think there's a real fear that it will, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it tomorrow when Richard Locke has a chance to speak, who's been doing some phenomenal research on Nike and the way in which it has improved its capacity, and other firms have improved their capacity to, in fact, only as a result, I must say, of a considerable amount of student activism and public pressure and some labor union and government pressure as well, but have improved their capacity to monitor their very complex supply chains all the way down the line, though with some spectacular failures as well, as in Indonesia last year. So what we really have to worry about is what's going to happen in the light of the fiscal crisis to those kinds of commitments that we've begun to enforce. And I do think there are some green shoots, as we say in the United States, though I think they're going to need some tender, loving care. And here I wish we had a stronger labor movement in the United States and a stronger social movement in the United States to sort of ensure this. But here's a case where I think actually the protectionism instinct that much of the American public has may actually work to the advantage of some workers across the world, because there is going to be some real commitment, I think, to ensuring that our trading relationships actually live up to the labor codes and labor standards as a way of evening the playing field with workers who are lower paid workers in other parts of the world. I think an intelligent stimulus package around trade would also require, we were talking in the last panel about various kinds of institutions and rules and rights that are already in place as part of the international system. And the US actually has laws in place, as does Australia, as does the European Union, that requires that goods that come into the country have been produced under reasonably decent conditions. There's some variation on that in our rules and regulations. So, you know, part of the protectionist instinct in the stimulus package may actually require us to see that that happens.
Well, I want to take that up with Andrew Hewitt here because I want to try and get a picture, if you like. We've talked about Australia, we've talked about the United States, and we've talked about that need to maintain some kind of standards, not only with your own workers, but the products that come in. Now, Andrew, can you give us a bit of a picture, if you like, of where you're seeing the hotspots in terms of people losing their jobs because of the global financial crisis in foreign countries? Where are the places that concern you?
Well, the industries
Yes.
in export manufacturing, garments, electronics and services, they're the main victims of this crisis. To make it concrete, in India, 700,000 clothing and textile workers have lost their jobs in last year, let alone what's happened this year. Sri Lanka, Cambodia, each lost about 30,000 jobs, mostly in the garment industry. Philippines lost about 40,000 jobs. So, and then you see in China, there are now something like 20 million internal migrants who've lost their jobs who are now on the move. So it's those sectors in the firing line. Those sectors are the ones where the greatest contraction in employment is taking place.
So tell us what happens when an Indian family, for example, loses the job, and they've up until now been doing reasonably well, they're perhaps educating their children, and then they find that they no longer have a job in a textile mill. What's the implication of that? Well, other than the obvious?
It obviously varies from family to family, individual to individual. But what you may find is that they may have been a migrant from the rural areas into the urban areas, and that they don't have the social roots, the roots in the urban area, and so they go back to the rural areas. That places greater pressures in the countryside. And it places greater pressure particularly around food security and making sure whether people have got enough food to eat. In most of those instances, people don't have lack access to basic services or need to pay for it. If they no longer have access to an income, they can't pay access to a medical clinic, they can't get their kids into school, and so on and so on. It's the World Bank's estimated a 1% decline in developing countries' growth rates will trap 20 million more people in poverty, and that's absolute poverty. That's the $1.20 a day US figure. That's the sort of poverty that we're talking about.
So what happens to a family that once was sending its children for a basic education but now finds it can't? What does that mean in social terms, not now, but in 10 years down the track?
Well, I think clearly that means those kids will not get to school. That means it won't be as educated a workforce as what you had previously. It means their income, their asset accumulation will be a lot less than what it could have been. It is going to lead over time to much greater social tensions, and we can start to see that in China at the moment. It's a recipe for people being locked into poverty rather than finding a pathway out of poverty.
And I think that's the reason that several of us, all of us in fact, have argued that we really do have to pay attention to labor rights and human rights and social protections in this particular period, because otherwise we're creating an immensely challenged, impoverished group of people who are only going to come back to haunt us in a million different ways.
And it's the next generation. That's what, in a sense, there's to be a lost generation. And that's the tragedy. What we were seeing in the early part of this century was a real confidence that maybe the Millennium Development Goals, which are set for 2015, there was a fair chance in a lot of the countries of the world we're going to actually achieve those.
Right.
That's now getting off the agenda. And that's both an enormous waste of talent, but it's also a desperate tragedy for the people who are locked into that poverty.
Margaret Levy, is that the way this is obviously the pressure that you talked about when you were talking about the United States, but it has to, and you were saying, look, we hope we can stop a race to the bottom, if you like, but isn't that just an immense pressure for an Indian worker or a Chinese worker? They say, okay, well, look, you can still have your job, but we're going to cut your pay in half. What's the consequence of that?
Their pay is cut in half.
Yeah, well...
and they eat a lot less.
But internationally, what's the consequences
Well, internationally, I think it creates a real need for I mean, we were talking in the last panel about international arrangements to deal with financial crises. We need better international arrangements to deal with social crises, which is what we're really facing right now in a potential very big political crisis. And what we've done is sort of relied largely on big donors like the Gates Foundation or whoever, some bilateral aid from countries, the Scandinavian countries, Britain, Australia, the US have all been relatively generous, and on lots of NGOs and church groups. And this is really an inadequate response to what's becoming a worldwide social crisis. So, you know, this may be one of those Rahm Emanuel moments where the crisis might create an opportunity for a real rethink about how we deal with these kinds of social problems and to create a kind of Bretton Woods of social institutions.
All right, but nevertheless...
Though obviously not ill-designed, like we learned in the last group.
Well, I want to talk a bit more about the reaction to this, but Tony Marr, if this starts to happen, that in fact pressure comes on labour rights, that, you know, child labour becomes fashionable again in some way, if basically a whole lot of your rights are taken away if you want to keep a job, and the products there are made more cheaply, what does that mean for Australia?
Well, the choice the world's got is growth, sustainable growth, or just growth for a period of time. Without labour rights to spread the wealth in developing countries and developed countries, then the collective objective of continued and sustained growth is under threat, both here and overseas. And I think that rather than assist the race to the bottom, we need to do exactly what Margaret was saying, and that's insert in trade treaties or trade instruments social clauses about things like labour rights. They are an incredibly effective way of spreading wealth. And for developing countries, it seems to me that the best way to get a middle class instead of an underclass is to have mechanisms that assist the spread of wealth during the growth phases in an economy. We don't have a growth phase at the moment, but we will again. And so now's the time to focus on those structural things that need to be done.
Jay Radisich, I want to ask you about this because potentially for people in Australia who are small business people who often are selling foreign-made goods, in some ways, there is, if the products become cheaper, there is value there. There is an advantage, if you like, for what they're doing. How does small business respond to this? Do they have to have a sort of social conscience here?
I've been listening to the other panellists, and there's two ways I'd like to respond to your question. One's picking up on what Margaret said a moment ago. And if you take the case of China with the 20 million, you know, the population of Australia unemployed in China right now, if we don't take as a global community, we don't take a sustainable approach and put some social supports in for our friends and neighbours, there's going to be massive social upheaval and unrest, and that will have a massive flow-on effect to our entire region. It may actually prevent the importation of some of those goods, which small businesses certainly do import to be able to either build products from or simply on sell. Because if things go wild in China, I would not hazard a guess about what could happen, how it could happen. There's essentially been a containment policy in China. If the economy is going along okay, the community there has said, without saying it, we're just going to overlook some stuff that's going on because we're getting by okay. But the impact of the GFC in that country in particular, that sentiment in China is now changing dramatically, and it will have a flow-on. It could, have a flow-on effect to all of us. But let me just bring the high-level conversation that we're having down to the ground a little bit, because this is the trouble from the small business point of view with having discussions about human rights, etc. Does anyone run a small business in the audience? A couple, okay, well that's good.
Well, I run a small business with 20 odd shops around this country, so I'm in that game as well.
The trouble is, most small business owners take the opportunity, don't have the time to come to events like this and have these intellectual, thought-provoking discussions about the globe. They're literally going to the business, making sure it runs, making sure, working an extra shift if somebody doesn't show up for their 4 hours, going home, dinner, 8 till 10 p.m, they all get on the internet to do their bookkeeping, the BAS and everything that has to be done. It's a pretty full-on life, especially for micro business owners. So then we come to a different kind of right, or human right rather, something like occupational health and safety standards, and maybe Tony can help me out on this one. So there's a process in place right now to harmonise the OH&S standards across the country. Now this could have, outstanding human rights benefits for lots of disabled people, for example, who currently find a lot of retail spaces and other sorts of small businesses quite inaccessible to them. They have the right to be able to use these facilities to shop at these premises. What is the cost impact on that local business, on the business owner? Can the business owner afford it? What will be the implication for that business owner's staff? And would they have to close down, or should they have to close down, if they cannot provide, for example, an accessible shop front? Or should all of our prices go up? And that's the sort of real-life Australian issue that small businesses are facing.
Well, and I think it gets back to one of your initial points of being very clear about what we mean by human rights.
Yes.
You started off by saying Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's obviously a starting point. But there are a number of other key international agreements which our government has signed on, which most governments in the world have signed on. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the one on civil and political rights, the CEDAW about discrimination against women, racial discrimination and the rights of children. I'd say in the area of labour rights, there's some core international labour organisation agreements, so half a dozen core ones about
5 or 6.
The right to organise, collective bargaining, no child labour, no forced labour, occupational health and safety. That for me is the human rights platform. And then we've got to look at who's got responsibility. And I do believe the government has got the state, as the signatory to those various agreements, has got the prime responsibility. But then they've got to create the legislative framework that all of us can live with and work with. And to be frank, I'm a head of an organisation with 300 staff in Australia, 300 staff outside of Australia. So I have some of the similar pressures as what you're talking about. But we try to work within that framework, and that's the framework which I think for decent employment and decent living standards and a decent society we should all be trying to aim for.
We should. I would put to you, Andrew, that you've got much more fat in your organisation than I do, and that the people who I represent do. You've got 600 staff globally. I represent people with up to 20 headcount. Different kettle of fish. If one person doesn't show up, it changes everything. If somebody, breaks their arm, or any tiny little variation in that business model has a massive effect, which is ultimately absorbed physically, emotionally and financially by that small business owner. Now, the other thing about small business, we talk about running a business and there's this idea in some people's mind that it's all about having something that grows and gets bigger and gets more successful, etc., etc. Sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes it's just someone who's created a job for themselves. They have an income. The income accrues for so long as that person is working at the end. There's nothing to sell. It doesn't necessarily grow. They don't want it to grow. But shouldn't they have some rights as well in the endeavour that they engage in? And if you look at education and training, in fact, most of the federal government supported education and training programs, which are available to staff or to working people, no matter who they work for, are actually small business owners are expressly denied access to some of those. Now, Small Business Minister Craig Emerson yesterday made an announcement that there will be some adjustment to that. So out of the 711,000 productivity places, some of those will be open to small business owners to engage in some of those modules, so they can get some extra assistance in basic things that they need to run their business.
Tony, I want to ask you about what's the balance there? I mean, you want jobs, you want small business to do well, you also want rights and conditions for workers.
Well, I'll start with a confession. I mean, we've failed to properly engage with small business, and and yet many of us, are married to a small business owner, or many of our members, when they get retrenched, go and buy a job.
Exactly.
They buy the local news agency or a taxi plate. And so it's, we've really failed to properly engage with the policy concepts. There is a difference between rights and standards in terms of the development of OHS standards, for example. There needs to be a balance struck, and we all participate in that process.
So what can be done?
What is OHS?
Occupational health and safety.
Oh, sorry. That's the short answer.
Cultural divide.
So what can be done? Do you think, from the union point of view, how do you engage in that?
Well, I suppose it's the same as we've engaged with environment groups on the issue of climate change. You start to speak to people. You don't ignore them and pigeonhole them, and that cuts both ways. And that's been very successful on the climate change debate, but that's a whole other debate, although I think it is actually got a lot of links with this, because after the GFC, the economic restructuring of the globe pursuant to climate change initiatives is the next big challenge for labour rights and human rights and standards and incomes. But yeah, in terms of standards, there has to be a dialogue. But we are talking about rights, and the key thing to remember is that they are called inalienable rights for a reason. They're not dispensable, and what we make of them in each country is up to a collective process. And we've done fairly well over the years, with the last decade notwithstanding, in this country. But for the development of the globe, I mean, if you take free trade and globalisation as a given, which I happen to do, the agenda has to be an aggressive rights-setting agenda.
All right, now I just want to say at this point, could I just say this point, in about 5 minutes, after we've finalised the discussion, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and there are 2 microphones here, and you are invited to ask questions of the panel and have some more debate. But let me go on with what you're going to say, Professor.
Well, what we're focusing a lot on small business, and it's quite important, and there's no question about it, and it's important in Australia, and it's important in the US, and it's important in countries all over the world where you talk about small producers who are making coffee that then becomes fair trade or doesn't become fair trade coffee, or small textile collectives, or whatever it is. But the real problem is big business. The real problem is big business and big government. Absolutely. And the governments that aren't enforcing the rights and the standards, both, in terms of big business. And part of the big business problem are the kinds of ways in which supply chains have developed over the last bunch of years. And small business is hurt by that.
Jay is getting excited by this.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, we're all hurt by it.
Now, what
we're all hurt and we're all helped by it.
Okay, now, but explain to us what you...
Because prices for consumer goods have gone down.
Yes.
But they've gone down at a very high cost to a lot of us, really. So we may be able to get something cheaper, but it's literally off of somebody's back.
Exactly.
And it's off of the back of the worker who isn't paid properly. It's off of the back of the small businesses, which are forced out of business because of Walmartization or Nikeization or Adidasization or whatever, who have created this whole new mechanism for how you actually produce goods to the consumer. Where they're looking for the cheapest way to do it. They're driving certain kinds of businesses. I mean, the classic story of Rubbermaid in the United States, a wonderful business.
What is Rubbermaid?
Rubbermaid is a thing, it does things for occupant, no. It's all kinds of, it's the things you put on the bathroom floor. It's anything made out of rubber that we used in our kitchens and all over. It was a major set of products in the US with a fabulous company that produced them, and was literally driven out of business because Walmart started to sell Rubbermaid, became its biggest purchaser, and then started driving the price down below a price that Rubbermaid could compete, because then Walmart would hold Rubbermaid up against a Chinese producer of a comparable product. And no one was telling Walmart and making Walmart, and I'm using Walmart here, but it could be any of these
major chains.
Major chains. The US government was not requiring Walmart to meet the standards that were in trade agreements and that Congress had passed, and enforcing the rights so that the Chinese workers were at least being paid reasonably, weren't living in these terrible barracks that get locked up at night, et cetera. So, the supply chain problem is a crucial issue here that then affects small business, affects labor unions in the developed world, and workers who don't have the advantage of being in labor unions, and clearly undermines the capacity of workers in developing countries.
Now, Andrew,
and governments aren't doing what they should do in either set of countries in terms of protecting their populations.
Andrew, you wanted to say something.
I think Margaret's described the problem perfectly, but I think what we need to look at is how some changes happen, and positive changes happen. Earlier on, Margaret mentioned Nike, which every survey, Nike's name comes up as the worst. Well, the reality is there's actually been change in that company. And
a lot of change.
And it's not the equivalent of greenwash. It's actually been change of substance, which has seen them both better quality monitoring processes, a greater transparency, informing organisations like ours who their suppliers are so we can organise monitoring.
Right.
All those sorts of things have happened. It's not perfect. They've got a long way to go. There was a recent instance when one of their supply factories in Malaysia, significant abuses came out where the workers had their passports confiscated, they had to put a bond up, all those sorts of things. But the remedial action was taken quickly. How did it happen with Nike? Well, one, it took a long time.
Yeah.
It wasn't overnight. It took a long time by organisations right around the globe applying a lot of pressure, particularly consumer pressure and pressure affecting their reputation. And that's how we got changed. We had a dialogue, we've kept the engagement going. The fact that we run a website called Nike Watch says something, we've been doing that for about 13 years, says something about that sort of pressure that you've got to apply. But change is possible. But Nike also demonstrates an area, and this is where the Walmart experience comes in, it demonstrates an area where change is much more difficult to achieve. And that's where the brand has no real value. And so when you go to the Walmarts or Kmarts and get the home brand, where you can't apply any of the public pressure, reputation means nothing there. That's a lot more difficult to achieve change.
All right, so what do we have to... Well, Jay, I'd like you to bring you in. I guess you really want to have a burst here.
I love that you brought up the home brand issue, Andrew, because last week or the week before, I was at the ACCC in Canberra, and we had a regular small business consultative committee meeting, and the chairman, the commissioner, was on the video conference, and I had a bit of a barney with him because I'm quite a staunch advocate, I suppose, for choice and competition. And I really, really question the ACCC on regular occasions. Every time that there's another takeover and so forth, there's one argument that, in fact, the ACCC frequently pushes that says, well, if consumers want home brands, then that means they get cheaper prices, and sometimes there's better quality than the other brands, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's great in the short term. But where is the mandate of the ACCC? What time frame does that actually apply in? And I would argue that it should be across the entire time spectrum, because the minute that these large supermarket chains can force out, well, essentially they stop anybody else from getting their very, very expensive shelf space so that there's only their own home brands left, they've essentially pushed down the prices for all of the primary producers. Most farmers are small businesses as well. Then what do we have left? We have the farmers getting paid very little. Lots of the farms end up being corporatised anyway. Who knows what what might happen, what the impacts on quality might be if it starts to become about, you know, GM and extra fertilisers and all of that sort of increasing increasing quantity outputs. And then we don't have any choice in the medium to long term anyway. So what was the point of having the ACCC in the first place?
All right, well look, let's start perhaps with the diagnosis. What do we do? What would you like to see done in that regard? I mean, without writing a book on it, which I suspect you could.
Well, I sort of have, but I can give people the web link later. Can I go last? Because I need
All right, okay.
I want to hear the others for a bit.
Professor, could you tell us what you think governments now have to do? Is there a role for the Australian government, for the American government to say, we are not going to allow a race to the bottom that goes across the board, that goes globally, that takes standards down in our country and other countries?
Well, in the absence of some kind of international regulatory arrangement, I think we rely on, you can't prevent the race to the bottom, and I'm not even sure I totally accept that terminology. But what you can do is ensure that each of our governments actually lives up to rules and regulations that they've already put in place, affecting workers in our countries and also affecting workers and the production of products in other countries. We can also increase consumer pressure in a variety of ways through organizations like Oxfam, through the fabulous student organizations who drive me crazy sometimes at the University of Washington and elsewhere, but whose idealism and commitment cannot be questioned, and who've done a fabulous job of ensuring that universities around the US, and I think it's happening in this country as well, are beginning to really take seriously their institutional purchasing practices so that they buy goods that are produced under conditions in which relatively fair labor standards and rights have been achieved. And that then creates and the goods that bear the logo of the University of Washington or the University of Sydney are licensed under reasonably good conditions. And that helps to generate an educated consumer public that won't every single time take into account how a good is produced, but at least it'll be a part of their consciousness that can be activated, and we can begin to change that. And then the other thing I think we need to do is to really pay attention to those countries which are in fact enforcing their own labor rights. So, you know, we for a long time in the US were buying goods from China that were produced by prison labor, right? Which it violates virtually every code and standard that exists in the world. Well, why aren't we buying from countries which are meeting the standards? Why aren't we encouraging people to do that? So we've got to create more education, we've got to live up to our rules and regulations, and we've got to really think about creating some kind of international regulatory system of some sort that goes beyond what we have, and some of what we have is quite good, that comes out of the old International Labour Organization structure, which is basically the unions, the transport workers unions, the other unions that have formed confederations around the world and which are alerting us to problems and trying to enforce rules and regulations in countries around the world.
Well, I think that's probably a cue for Tony Marr. Tony, do you believe that you can have any success in getting better understanding between unions here and governments and whatever unions exist in developing world? Can there be pressure? Can there be change?
Oh, absolutely. There are existing international union structures, and unfortunately they don't represent everybody. We were victims of the Cold War for a long time, where both sides had to have their international union federations. We more or less almost got past that. But the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the biggest one, doesn't campaign on labour standards throughout the world. It campaigns on labour rights.
That's why I'm making that distinction.
That is incredibly important. And Margaret's right that ultimately it's a matter for the leadership of national governments and international institutions and regulatory frameworks. Unfortunately, a lot of the trade treaties that have been negotiated, many countries resist social clauses being inserted. Although helpfully, I can say in the World Bank in April deleted a a provision that they used to use to rate countries. They used to rate a country highly if it had minimum labour standards. And so you had Belarus and some African countries being rated very highly. So those small changes are important, but in terms of leadership, it's governments. Unions can play a role lobbying governments, and they do. We have imperfect international structures, but we do utilise them. The other thing that can be done is the sort of campaigning work that's done, and also the private sector leadership we do generate pressure. Many stakeholders generate pressure to get decent reporting standards and corporate social responsibility guidelines. Most of those are voluntary, unfortunately, but we're in the mix in that as well. So.
All right. Now, very quickly, Andrew, I can hearing those 2 points of view, and I'm sure that you would agree with a lot of that, but what do you say to the Australian Trade Minister who says, oh, look, doing these sorts of things creates, if you like, a new protectionism? How do you argue that?
And I've heard that argument over the years.
I'm sure you have.
I don't think it is a new protectionism because it is based upon certain universal standards which should be applied across the board. And those universal standards, in this sense, are universal rights, which, as I think we've outlined or discussed, should apply across the board. I'd also say for the Australian case, I don't think it helps the Australian economy to be suggesting that we should be looking for even undermining some of the basic terms and conditions of employment in this country. And I think we've got a future as an economy if we have a stronger relationship with countries overseas which also have high standards. So it's in our interests to get those high standards and high applicability of the rights. I think there are things Australia should also be thinking about doing. I think the critical issue is about what governments can do, but it's not just governments. But delivery in another industry which we've not talked about is in the mining industry. Tony's in some of the worst human rights abuses that take place in employment are in the mining industry throughout the developing world. Australia has a highly internationalised mining industry. We need legislation to cover the actions of Australian companies operating overseas, so to make sure that they actually apply basic human rights standards in their work. Industry has a code of conduct which you could drive a mining truck through. It's got so many holes. That's a role for government. There is a role for the community as a whole, and that sort of ethical consumerism push is part of it. And then there's a role for business and some of the things that have been canvassed, both through procurement policies, making sure they've only got their own act together. But we need to change all of it combined needs to change the discourse, change the expectations about what sort of society we want to live in and what our global interconnectedness is. And clearly, I don't believe it's in anyone's interest for us as a relatively rich country to be living cheek by jowl with some of the poorest people in the world. That's not a future I want my son to live in, basically.
Can I just report on one, this will just take a second, some research that's been done, which really talks about what the private sector can do, which is that trading partners from countries with higher labor rights and standards that then more or less require them of those that they trade with has what has been called the California effect, because it seems to have raised the environmental standards that meet. California will only get goods that have met certain environmental standards, and there's now been research that suggests that really is having a consequence around environmental issues, and that it might also be beginning to have an effect in terms of labor rights and standards. That if companies or states, in that case, impose certain kinds of rules and regulations but have to trade, then in fact it raises the level for everybody.
Sounds good. Jay Radisich, do you want to just finish off there?
Let me throw this out. We've been talking a lot about the globalisation. So we have lots of migrants coming to Australia. We've got new industrial relations laws coming into effect, which have changes in terms of rights and responsibilities for both employees and employers. 30% of small business owners out of the 1.2 million employing, sorry, hang on, got to get it right. 4 million people employed. Anyway, a couple of million employing small businesses. 30% of them are not English speaking by background.
Right.
Sorry, are non-English speaking background. Now, right now and you might again correct me, Tony, but as far as I'm aware, and I've been trying to pay attention to this one, the Fair Work Act, there's no information out and about other than really the legislation itself. Now, there is funding from the federal government to conduct an education and training program, which we've put in a bid for, and we haven't heard the announcement yet. But in our thinking in developing that, we thought we have to have a responsibility as a representative organisation to make sure that we're giving our small business owners the best chance to do the right thing by their employees, so that everybody wins. So
but you're limited by lack of information, essentially.
Well, no, we've got the information. Our proposal actually proposes to deliver the information education modules in 7 languages, because the most spoken languages for small business owners are Vietnamese, Cantonese, Greek, Italian, Arabic, and two others. Anyway, okay. The point is, government also has to change its thinking about its rules and regulations to be practical and usable.
Yes.
Because I don't believe small business owners want to do the wrong thing, but they need to be equipped to be able to do the right thing.
Well, on that note, we may throw the discussion open to the floor. If you'd like to ask some questions, you're very welcome to. Just if you could say perhaps who you are, where you're from or whatever, and then who you'd like to answer your question. Far away.
Hello, my name's Chris Hoy. I'm a student at the University of Sydney. The question's directed at Margaret and Andrew in particular. I was just wondering, how does the tension be balanced between trying to ensure minimum labour rights in the developing world while also trying to ensure that you don't undermine the comparative advantage of many developing countries, which is quite often in large manufacturing, for example, at a lower cost than in the developed world?
Well, comparative advantage is an interesting term because comparative advantage is, of course, a political economic term, and it refers to what real advantages a country has at any given moment. And what the developing world has is low-cost labor that's willing to do all kinds of work and jobs that often people in the developed world are not willing to do, and in ways that they haven't been willing to do it. And the developed world's real comparative advantage, particularly countries like the US and Australia, is with a highly educated labor force that has also got very high skills. Now, the immigration issue raises other questions, but they're coming in here and in my country in part because they want to be part of that comparative advantage, right? To get those skills and that education. So it actually shouldn't be a disadvantage to have certain things produced in one country and sold in another country if the developed country is actually keeping up in terms of providing other kinds of jobs, other kinds of industries, being innovative, having small business begin to create venture businesses that then do grow. Not all will, of course, as you said. And that's the way it should work, as long as, in fact, the playing field is kept relatively level so that you're not creating what Mark has called the race to the bottom.
Andrew?
I think we've got to be careful not to overstate the significance of labour costs in a lot of the products we buy. Garments, the apparel industry. Most of us, I'm sure I am, I wear clothes at the moment which come from China. But the labour costs in China are 4 to 5 times higher than the labour costs in Bangladesh.
Yep.
China is responsible for 42% of the global apparel exports. Bangladesh only responsible for 7.5%. What's the difference? It's about reliability of supply, it's about the infrastructure, it's all about the ease of exporting and conducting trade. All those sorts of things are much more critical for why China is dominant in that particular market and that particular industry. So the comparative advantage is not so much low wages, it's relatively low wages here, but added to by those additional factors. And then we've got a much more complete picture about why certain countries and certain industries in certain countries have prospered.
Okay. Could I add a point?
Yes, of course.
These things are not static either.
Right.
The call centres in India used to be 6 times cheaper on wage costs. It's now half to 2/3, I understand. And so the future of that industry is really going to be tagged to the growing domestic market and the international component less and less. So the business relocation is slowing. It's still happening, but it's slowing. And so their economies will change. And very similar in China. China introduced a range of labour laws recently. They introduced some standards too, double time on Sundays, who'd have thought? And so it's great when you've got a one-party state. Well, it's very easy anyway. And so these things do change, and a number of private sector businesses are now investing in sort of more distant inland areas of China, and that's harder for business, but they're chasing where the lower wages now are. So, and that's partly, not solely, but partly as a result of some engagement with the international trade unions with their Chinese counterpart, who are not formally part of our federation. But there's been some engagement on that.
So, change is the constant. Yeah. Next question, please.
Hi, my question's for Andrew. There's been a lot of talk in the media recently about how a lot of NGOs and human rights organisations even are losing money because of the global financial crisis. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I think, lost $11 billion. And I was just wondering how this is affecting the implementation or the education for human rights in developing countries, whether it's making a large impact or it's not really at all.
We should turn to Andrew.
Our resources are a bit tighter. I'd love to lose
Andrew,
$11 billion. It would be a
nice
challenge. Yeah.
Is there anything you want to tell us?
To be frank, we're still fundraising well. We're still our small business trading operation is like most retail operations is having difficult times. How we've been hit is by the collapse of the Australian dollar. Because a lot of the countries we work in are effectively US dollarised economies. Timor, Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, you don't pay your staff in Zimbabwean dollars unless you've got a very large vehicle to carry all the dollars in. You pay them in US dollars. And what we're then faced with is greater demand from the people, the communities and the people that we're trying to assist. And that's a real difficulty because we're having to say no. And that's not something we like to do.
I was just in Zambia and was part of a group of people talking about some of these issues. And it's clearly having disastrous consequences in terms of there are more people in need and fewer resources to give to people. On the other hand, it's also encouraging some of the donor organizations to rethink their strategies in ways that I think could be more sustainable over time, instead of just being charities. I'm not talking about Oxfam here as much as some of the others that we can think of. And instead of just giving money out in a kind of charity way, it's really beginning to create some community building and some restructuring of how that aid is given, so that it ends up growing the aid and creating more possibilities for the people who receive it than if they just get a dole.
So just at one other point, which I think is really critical in understanding the impact of this crisis. Remittances, mostly from people from citizens of developing countries who are mostly moved to richer countries, Middle East or wherever.
Mexico to the US.
Mexico to the US, are worth three times the aid flows. Yes. Those people tend to be at the bottom of the pile in the countries that they're working in. They're going to be the first laid off, the first made redundant. The loss of that income doesn't just affect them, it affects their communities back in their home countries. Yeah. And that's a hidden impact of this crisis, which is not getting much publicity. But that will, in a sense, have an even greater lasting impact. And to get back to some of the initial comments about the lost generation, that's really how it's going to hurt. And that's affecting the capacity of organisations like mine. We may be rethinking and trying to respond in a creative way. We're doing that with fewer resources. At the same time, we've quite new and unique challenges, and the decline of remittances is going to be one of the big ones.
Fair enough. Next question.
I'm Nahid Kabir from Perth. My focus is on the new immigrants and their new home, which is Australia. There are some new immigrants who have arrived this year, say for example from a non-English speaking country like Bangladesh. They applied for immigration 2 years ago because their friends, when they came here as new immigrants, they got jobs in engineering, say for example, a skilled job. So that was their incentive to come here. But now, since there is no job, well, their children are getting benefited from school, which is good, good education in Australia. But the social security, the new immigrants can't get the social security for the first 2 years. And so these people are virtually living in poverty. So since Australia has a role to play, I guess, so your opinion, whether it should be waived and it should be, there should be a change of policy that they get the social security from day one because for the economic crisis. Thank you.
Well, that's a tricky one. Is there anyone who wants to tackle that issue and has a view on it?
Well, I'd make a general comment that Australia is a rich country and we have a state, a government which has got a fair capacity to look after all. And when times are tough, that's a greater need to even look up, even greater need and greater obligation, I think, to look after those who are at the bottom of the pile. And clearly the newest arrivals in the circumstances you outlined, some of those who are at the bottom of the pile and don't have access, should have access to some form of support, some form of safety net.
Tony,
look, our social safety net is inadequate and by international standards of the other developed countries, and it needs to be improved in a whole host of areas, including that one.
Bet it's better than ours.
Yes, that's right. And but we'd rather the Europeans. And forgive me for cherry picking, but it's a bit like the labour rights thing. I mean, if it's part of sustainable growth model. You should spread labour rights and human rights, and if we can spread social safety nets, that helps, I think, sustainable economic growth.
Okay, that's good.
Hi. As you all mentioned that we need to afford human rights and labour rights more than before in the financial global crisis. But I do respect that idea that we all need to implement the idea of human rights and labour rights in all countries when we talk about development also. But like me, some of you might have seen the life in a developed country and the life in a developing and a poor country. So don't you think it's too stringent and a bit unfair to link non-trade issues like human rights and environmental issues like labor rights with trade at the early stages of development for developing and especially for poor countries? Like, for example, I personally hate child labor, but in a poor country, like maybe in Southeast Asia, if the children are prohibited from going to work, I have seen them, they either ended in begging or in a brothel. So this is not the solution to link all those non-trade, which we call like linkages issue, to link with trade, unless and until they reach a certain stage of development. So I think survival is the main issue for this kind of people, and to link human rights and labor rights other than the basic one, I think it's a bit luxury for those kind of people. So I don't actually 100% agree with the comment that we can afford to implement human rights and labor rights even in a global financial crisis, with due respect to all those what you have said. So what do you think in terms of these kind of things?
Well, I think that gets to the point that we're not talking about a guaranteed minimum wage or something like that. We are talking about some core human rights, which I think should be the starting point for all basic public policy, how we can advance that. I don't think bans and prohibitions rarely work. You know, your instance of child labour, unless there is education provided and proper schooling and the like, it's unlikely to be to really get children out of child labour. But I do believe society should be able to move beyond child labour. It tends to be, in straight economic terms, it tends not to be a particularly efficient means of producing goods. And abusive child labour is something which I think should be one of the starting points of human conversation, to be frank. And I think societies would benefit from not doing that. But it's not saying that there should be minimum wages or the like. It's those 6 core ILO standards, International Labour Organisation standards, which should be applied. It's important that it's not seen as part of a protectionist agenda. I don't think it is part of a protectionist agenda. It is trying to set the terms of conversation across all countries and all societies.
But it's nonetheless, I think you're raising a really crucial issue here. And it's a very hard one to answer well, because there's no question that the only way a country will develop is if it has some jobs. And often those jobs require various members of the family to work that in a more developed country we might not have work. What I think needs to be done in those cases is it's a question in part of redistribution and the national commitments of that country. And it may be redistribution from some of the richer countries to some of the poor countries to help provide, as well as from some of the richer in those poorer countries to not be so greedy, to ensure that you're providing some schooling. I mean, most of us in the US and Australia come from immigrant families somewhere. Not everyone, some of us are indigenous, but most of us are not. And, you know, the child labor was, you came home from school and worked in the family store or whatever it was. I mean, that was part of the story.
Talking about abusive child labor.
Absolutely. Right. And so we can begin to make some distinctions here, but Andrew's absolutely right. We have to find ways to ensure that if you're going to say no child labor, at least in the sense that children of school age should be going to school, and then if they do some work after school or before school, that's the way it goes. But you have to make sure there's schooling and that they can afford the school uniforms if those are required, that they can afford the milk at lunch if that's not provided, etc. And so that requires some kind of really redistributive thinking, and that's why I keep coming back to that we need to think about this in an internationalist way, so that we're beginning to think about those problems and not just saying, well, if your country doesn't live up to these, doesn't provide these rights, well, you can just forget development.
So I think what you're saying is that if our country, for example, in Australia, we say, well, we're not going to take those goods produced under those circumstances, it's also beholden on us to say, well, we have to do something to create a situation in that country where education and development and goods and a livelihood can be created.
Well, we have to help with that, absolutely.
So that is our responsibility if we put those regulations on.
Doesn't mean that we pay for it all.
No,
I don't think it necessarily means that, but we have to help find a mechanism to make sure those things are provided. That's why I object to the race to the bottom, because the race to the bottom language is always talking about the workers in the developed countries. You don't want to force the workers in the developing countries below the bottom.
No, quite.
And that's, I think, what your point is about.
Next question, please.
Anna Solar-Bassett, University of Sydney, Arts Law. I was wondering, there's a lot of talk about international regulation. I'd like your opinions on whether or not Australia should implement those international regulations on a national level and whether or not that should be through statute or constitutionally, in terms of human rights.
Now, who do you want to ask that question of?
In general, I'd like... There's a debate going around in Australia at the moment whether or not we should implement a Bill of Rights, specifically in relation to human rights.
You're talking very specifically about a Bill of Rights?
Yes.
Right, okay. Does anybody want to get at that? Because that's a very tricky one. Jay, come on.
Well, okay, hang on. Council of Small Business, I have to put that there.
Yep.
I personally don't support a Bill of Rights. I prefer the dynamic interpretation of the Constitution, but I can assure you that the Council of Small Business does not have an opinion on that issue.
Right.
And as an American, I can say we have that.
Yes, you have a Bill of Rights.
We have a Bill of Rights.
Tony,
Well, I'd have to say that we'd support a Bill of Rights because that might have prevented the federal government removing our labour rights in the last decade. So
didn't prevent ours.
No, that's true. But you got much smarter governments over there.
Well, I think there's a basic. If the government is going to, on our behalf, is going to sign up to international treaties and international covenants and conventions, then it can't just stay a signing ceremony in New York. It's actually got to be brought back into the Australian political and social context. Sorry?
You should calm down. You're getting a bit radical over
Me getting radical? Never. No, but and nor should it be regarded as something which we can just park when it gets inconvenient. So we signed up to the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, which is given legislative form in the Racial Discrimination Act. When it gets inconvenient, we suspend the RDA. Which is what we did around, what the government did around the Northern Territory intervention. So if we're going to sign up to those sort of treaties, we actually got to consistently follow through on them. And if that means a Bill of Rights, and again, I don't think Oxfam's got a view on the Bill of Rights, I'll probably discover we have, but Yeah, I think that's a clear option we should be looking for, but we've got to find ways which we can consistently apply the international treaties which we do sign up on. And a Bill of Rights may be an appropriate way to do it. If we do it in other legislative form, let's be consistent and not do it on a when it pleases us basis.
All right.
Now I have a totally different question. We had before men were lining up here to ask questions, and now we only have women.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Do you think it's because it's a male moderator?
Well, look, that's not a question that I can answer, frankly.
Because there are law students, so we know that there's more women in law schools, just not in partnerships in the big firms.
But given that I live in a household of women and they tell me constantly they're much smarter than I am, I'm prepared to accept all that. What I can tell you is a very practical fact that we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to try and get through these questions as quickly as I can, but that's probably all we've got time for. Far away.
Yeah, I'll try to be very succinct. George Friedman recently referred to China and the US being in a death hug economically, and I do see that as being true, and I am actually concerned about Australia going down the same route. There are many other markets and many other partners that we could potentially have here. I'm from the States, so I'm kind of talking from both sides, but and casting our fate in Australia with China in such a strong way, you know, kind of the lemming movement toward China's the future kind of thing, forgetting Latin America, forgetting India, forgetting, you know, any other rising economy. It's not entirely unrelated, but what I need to hear, both in environmental sustainability and also in these labor practices and everything, the political buzzsaw is going to be, how are you going to make that economically viable? And so probably it would come down to 5 sound bites about here is the critical path that happens, why it does make economic sense to have these fair labor practices in place at home and abroad, and why we need to comply to them. Because again, the hard-nosed reality is people are going to say, the U.S. consumer won't go for cheaper, higher prices, and we're reliant on the U.S. consumer for consumption. Otherwise, the whole global economy is going down the drain even faster. So again, you know, getting the compliance and getting the economic reality behind these arguments, which are essentially soft arguments until you can sell it with the economics of it.
All right.
So what do you say?
So the question is, what are the hard arguments for keeping those rights up?
Maybe instead of looking at unit pricing, we should be looking at instituting triple bottom line pricing so that we actually know the real costs. Because I think you're right, there are a lot of human rights standards that are in place and could be put in place, which in the short term and appear to increase prices, but in fact have a much greater benefit down the track. If people don't die on mine sites, that's a big cost saving. You know, training, recruitment, all the social cost, all the rest of it. We don't factor that in.
A hard-nosed argument, what you're asking. There's been plenty of research which has said that the societies and economies which are more equitable are better performers. Mm-hmm. And that's been coming out more and more, that's the basis of it. And the connection between acknowledging and recognising and respecting rights and an equitable, a fair society is pretty close. So if we have got a more equitable society, we've got a stronger economy. That for me is a very hard-nosed argument. You link equity with sustainability. I think that's the principles for the sort of economy and sort of society we should be looking for. I found it very interesting. Angela Merkel, who I would never regard as a softie, I understand at the G20 conference, she resisted any growth targets being put in the final declaration. What she wanted were targets about sustainability. I think there's a lot of real hard thinking which is taking place out there, which we're not picking up on in Australia. And we may, as you say, be in a death hug like the US and China, and Australia being down the side, still hugging the legs. That's not a healthy future for us. We need that diversity, but we need that understanding about the principles which are going to serve us well, not just in the year 2009, but 2020, 2050.
All right. Now, look, just to be fair to people, let's keep going with these questions, get as many in as we can.
Елена Zabortseva, University of Sydney.
Just a bit closer to the mic, we can hardly hear you.
Елена Zabortseva, PhD researcher from the University of Sydney. Actually, I have a question and a commentary. Unfortunately, I cannot afford myself a commentary, which is rather longer than my question. Professor Margaret Levy, you've mentioned the necessity to think, to create, and to establish new mechanisms related to observation of human rights in the labor of the labor force, which I think assumes that you think current system, especially in terms of UN family, is too weak to manage these problems. So do you think it's senseless to change current UN system or to re-establish it? Then since you've emphasized the necessity to establish new mechanism.
Well, the ILO system is too weak. It was never given enforcement powers. It was only given powers of research and sort of normative stance and some kind of organizational power. Nonetheless, just as all these things are mutable, amazing things have happened with the ILO. So those covenants that looked unenforceable have now become part of law and norms in a wide variety of countries. The organizations that it gave rise to, such as these federations of labor organizations that are under the ILO umbrella, some have become very effective organizations and some have not. So, you know, one of the things to do is to breathe life or more encouragement into organizations that exist at the international level. And the other thing is to, just as we had the Millennium Project, which was really a mobilization of international actors, there's no reason why we can't we're getting stuck. You know, that last question, we're stuck in old ways of thinking about doing things, and the crisis does give us an opportunity to think about new ways, to get rid of supply chains are creating enemies all over the place. So maybe we need to reorganize industries, and that would solve some of the problems in a variety of ways and be a hard answer. So, and I think the same thing's true about the international regulatory system.
All right, now look, I've been handed a note to say that I do have to wrap up. What I can tell you is there will be expert sessions after this which you may ask of these people some of the questions that you have, and I apologise for it to both of you, but time is our enemy. If I can just wrap it up by saying, first of all, to Andrew Hewitt, Professor Margaret Levy, Tony Ma, Jay Radicic, thank you very much for being part of this today. We appreciate it, I appreciate it, and it's been fascinating listening to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to this session, which I think it goes without saying, and I think the panel members will agree with me, is a terribly important session for so many reasons. One reason being is that it really matters. What happens on this issue really does affect people's lives. Now, it is called Labour and Human Rights. Can we afford them in the global financial crisis? Just to emphasise that. And I have a terrifically well-informed panel to talk about that, but just if I may digress before I introduce them, I want to tell you a story. Now, in another life, I worked for Senator John Button. God bless him. He's now departed, but he was a wonderful man and he taught me many, many things. But when he was vitally concerned in Australia with the way globalisation would work and the way it would affect people's lives, and he used to tell a little story, which I think is pertinent to this discussion today, and I hope you'll agree with me. And it starts something like this. There's a couple of guys and they're out in the wilderness and they are hiking. And they discover very rapidly that they are being chased by a nasty pack of bears that want to eat them. And they are running and the bears are chasing them and the bears are getting much closer. And they're running harder and the bears are still getting closer. When suddenly one of the blokes stops, sits down on a rock, pulls out his backpack and gets out a pair of running shoes, very flash running shoes. And the bloke next to me says, "What on earth are you doing?" And he said, "I'm getting out these shoes so I can run faster." And the bloke said, "But the bears are still going to catch us." And he says, "No, no, no, no. The impact of the global financial crisis on small business, which employs so many Australians, and can so rapidly be affected by things that happen both here and overseas." And Tony Ma is the General President of the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, and with a very special interest in the mining and energy sector, which has been much talked about, much debated, and where there are often furious Labor debates. So I welcome them all here today, and I want to ask first up a very quick question, if you would answer fairly in rapid fire fashion if you like. Can we afford to maintain labour and human rights with the bear of the global financial crisis coming down on us? Perhaps first of all, Andrew, you.
Well, we can't not afford, in fact, if anything, as a result of the global financial crisis, we've got an even greater need to pay attention to human rights and to labour rights. For people in developing countries, the global financial crisis is a triple whammy. It's on top of the increases in food prices and the increasingly evident impacts of climate change. And now's the time to be paying more attention to human rights, more attention to labour rights, not less attention.
Professor Margaret Levy, what do you say?
I couldn't agree more. We absolutely have to pay attention to labour rights and human rights. And there is a question of relativity and there is a question of competitiveness in the world. And I do think that the only way that many developing countries have a chance of competing is if they actually do improve their labour rights and create a set of workers who can produce a decent product, create a reliable labour force, and do it at a wage at which they can exist.
Tony Marr?
Oh, look, it's essential for the economy, whether you're talking about the developing world or the developed world. One of the contributors to the global financial crisis, in my view,
are extending out from 30 to 60 days in the last, say, year and a half, up to 75 days and beyond. So there's massive cash flow problems for many businesses. They're holding a lot less stock as a way to keep costs down. But the smart small business people, and this was a sentiment that came through really strongly in our conference yesterday, doesn't look to cutting their labour costs or the total quantum of labour that they have in the business. It's only, I would put to you, it's only it is a last resort for the most responsible small business owners.
Okay, so tell me this. At this point, what is the feedback you're getting about, say, paid maternity leave?
Universal paid maternity leave as proposed by the government?
Yes.
It's great.
Yes. So it's no imposition?
Women are always going to have babies. People are always going to employ women. Well, some of you. This whole PML thing, I think, has been blown out of proportion. Yeah. I mean, if the government had proposed a model whereby individual companies would have had to carry the burden of those costs, we would be having a completely different argument. But they've proposed universal access, paid parental leave, in fact. I think it's not PML, it's paid PPL. Everybody benefits equally, life goes on. We're finally getting up to standard with some of the more progressive European countries. I don't know what the big deal is.
Okay, fair enough. Well, Tony Marr, can I bring you into the discussion at this point? Where are you seeing the hotspots in Australia? Let's talk. I'm going to run faster than you. They're going to catch you. Now, sometimes when he would tell this joke, people would come up and say, Minister, what was the brand of the shoe? They had missed the point. The point of this is relativity. And relativity in a globalised world, I think everyone will agree, is everything. And the reality is, with the global financial crisis, which from here on in we may call the slathering bear, coming after us all, it will not escape employers and employees that labour is a very big input cost in many industries. And it's very easy to see the possibility of lowering your labour costs as a way of having a better set of running shoes and getting away from the bear. And the question is, how do we balance that out? Now, with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panel today. Professor Margaret Levy is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she took up her chair at the US Studies Centre in Sydney earlier this year. Her home base is the University of Washington in Seattle, and she has many, many qualifications. But for our purposes, she is an expert in international studies, and she specifically is very interested in the issue of human rights and labour rights in the global marketplace. Andrew Hewitt is the Executive Director of Oxfam Australia. His organisation is vitally concerned with raising living standards in developing countries and all countries across the globe. And of course, he would know, as you would know, that getting work is a very important part of raising those standards. Jay Radisich is the CEO of the Council of Small Business of Australia. More than anyone on this panel, I think I could say that she gets a very close look a grassroots look at the
was the inequality in the US economy. I mean, the absence of labour rights and effective collective bargaining laws meant that the wealth generated over the previous 3 decades didn't filter through to the working poor. And that was a big factor in the credit crunch. Unsustainable asset levels and debt levels, and that was exacerbated greatly by the lack of diffusion of that wealth.
Jay Radisich, from a small business point of view, what do you say to that?
I say absolutely. I know perhaps some people in the audience might have been expecting me to say something else, but it does start at the definition of human rights, and for me that's the articles outlined in the UDHR. So I think they are absolutely fundamental to all of us, whether we run businesses or we work in them. But as our fellow panellists have, well, my fellow panellists have mentioned, you need people to run the economy. People are society, so absolutely human rights are fundamental, but it's about how we define them and, importantly, how we apply them.
Okay, so let me start now on the broader issues and looking at how the global financial crisis is impacting. When you look around the businesses in Australia, how much pressure are they under, and how tempting is it to think, look, if I could only get those labour costs a little cheaper, this would be better for me?
Depends on the nature of the employer, depends on the nature of the business.
Well, who's really under pressure?
Yeah, most small businesses are under pressure. We actually had the National Small Business Summit in Melbourne yesterday. I just flew in this morning, and one of the presentations yesterday afternoon was from Dun & Bradstreet, who do a lot of credit reporting. And they indicated that there's an absolutely massive spike in companies defaulting on their payments, terms